Welcome, the Anointed Ones. Introduction. The most dangerous thing you can overhear is the truth someone never intended you to hear. There are moments when one accidental conversation can destroy an entire story people have built about you. Not because you stood up and exposed anyone. Not because you confronted them. Not because you made some dramatic announcement. It happens much more quietly than that. Someone is simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Hears a few words they were never supposed to hear, and suddenly pieces of your life begin falling into place. And here is the part that makes this so interesting. What they discover may not even be a shocking secret in the way they expected. Sometimes the real shock is discovering that you understood far more than you ever admitted. They may hear you explaining something, discussing a decision, acknowledging something you knew, or revealing a truth that completely contradicts the version of you they had created in their head. There is a reason accidental overhearing can feel so powerful. People naturally fill gaps in information with assumptions. When they don't know your motives, they invent them. When they don't understand your distance, they create an explanation. When they can't figure out why you changed, they often decide the answer without ever checking whether they're right. Then suddenly, they hear the missing piece. And that is when the entire story changes. The person who thought you were confused discovers you were paying attention. The person who thought you were reacting discovers you had already made a decision. The person who thought you were chasing their approval discovers you had quietly moved beyond it. And sometimes, the person who thought they knew your biggest secret discovers something even more uncomfortable. They were never actually close enough to know you in the first place. Funny how one overheard conversation can do what 20 explanations couldn't. Apparently, life doesn't always need a dramatic revelation. Sometimes it just needs someone with terrible timing and excellent hearing. But don't make the mistake of thinking this is simply about gossip or someone accidentally catching a private conversation. The deeper story is about perception. It's about the difference between what people think they know about you and what is actually true. Because when someone accidentally hears the part of your story you never performed for an audience, they don't just learn information. They suddenly understand why so many things about you never made sense to them. And once that realization hits, they cannot unhear it. So, let's uncover the 14 things they may have accidentally overheard that changed the entire way they saw you, and why the truth they discovered was far more powerful than the secret they thought they were looking for. Number 1. They overheard the version of you that you never perform for people. People can spend years believing they know you simply because they know the version of you that you allow them to see. Then one accidental conversation can dismantle that entire assumption. They hear you speaking naturally, without the careful words, polite reactions, or explanations you usually give, and suddenly they realize there is much more going on beneath the surface. You may have sounded calmer, sharper, more observant, or more decisive than they expected. Perhaps you were explaining something you had noticed months ago, connecting details they never thought you had seen, or calmly describing why you made certain decisions. The shock isn't necessarily the information itself. It's realizing that your quietness was never ignorance. You weren't clueless, you were collecting information. And that distinction can completely change how someone sees you. The person who underestimated you may suddenly replay old conversations in their mind, wondering how much you actually understood at the time. Every moment they dismissed you, every assumption they made, every little detail they thought escaped your attention, can suddenly take on a different meaning. That's when the uncomfortable realization arrives. They weren't dealing with someone who had nothing to say. They were dealing with someone who didn't feel the need to say everything they knew. And once they discover that, their confidence around you may never be quite the same again. Number 2. They discovered you were never as confused as you looked. For a long time, they may have mistaken your uncertainty for ignorance. Because you didn't react immediately, they assumed you didn't understand. Because you didn't challenge every strange comment, they thought you hadn't noticed. Because you sometimes stayed calm while everyone else was rushing to conclusions, they quietly decided you were simply lost. Then they overheard you explain what you had actually noticed. Suddenly the entire picture changes. They realize you had been watching patterns, remembering details, and connecting pieces long before anyone suspected it. You weren't failing to understand what was happening. You were taking your time before deciding what the information meant. There is a huge difference between not knowing and refusing to pretend you know something before you're certain. That discovery can be unsettling because it forces people to reconsider their own behavior around you. They may start wondering which conversations you heard, which contradictions you noticed, and how many things you chose not to confront. And that's where the real shock begins. Your calmness suddenly looks different. Your delayed reactions make sense. Even the moments when you appeared uncertain may have been moments when you were simply gathering enough information to reach your own conclusion. They thought they were ahead of you. Then they discovered you had been several steps ahead and simply hadn't announced it. Number 3. They realized someone had already told you the truth about them. This is the kind of discovery that can make a carefully constructed story collapse in seconds. They may have spent a long time believing you only knew their version of events. They gave explanations, adjusted details, left certain things out, and assumed you had no reason to doubt them. Then they accidentally heard that someone had already told you what really happened. Suddenly, their confidence disappears. The most uncomfortable part isn't that you were warned. It's that you never confronted them with the information. You didn't rush to expose them. You didn't announce that you knew. You simply carried the knowledge quietly and allowed their behavior to reveal even more. That changes everything because they begin wondering how long you've known. They may replay old conversations, remembering every time they gave you an explanation and you simply nodded. They may suddenly understand why certain conversations ended differently, why you stopped trusting particular promises, or why your behavior changed without an obvious explanation. And here's the brutal truth. Sometimes people become careless when they think they're dealing with someone who doesn't know. They reveal themselves through repetition. So when they discover that someone had already given you the missing piece, they may realize something deeply uncomfortable. The opportunity to control your perception had already disappeared. You weren't fooled. You were simply waiting to see whether their actions would confirm what you had already heard. Number 4. They realized your distance was based on information, not emotion. They may have convinced themselves that you pulled away because you were angry, jealous, offended, or simply being difficult. That explanation is comfortable because it makes your distance look emotional and temporary. Then they overhear the real reason, and suddenly their entire interpretation falls apart. You weren't creating distance because of one bad day. You had noticed a pattern. Maybe something was said that didn't match what you were previously told. Maybe promises kept changing. Maybe certain behavior repeated so often that you could no longer dismiss it as coincidence. You didn't need a dramatic confrontation to recognize what was happening. You simply adjusted your boundaries according to what you were seeing. That distinction matters. Emotion can make people react quickly. Information makes people reconsider carefully. When they discover that your decision was based on what you observed rather than how you felt in one particular moment, they may realize there is nothing they can fix with a temporary apology or charming explanation. You weren't trying to punish them. You were responding to evidence. And that can be incredibly uncomfortable for someone who believed they could change your mind by changing your mood. Suddenly, your distance has meaning. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't arrogance. It was a conclusion. And once someone realizes that, they may finally understand why getting close to you again isn't about saying the perfect words. It's about giving you a reason to trust what you see again. Number 5. They heard you refuse to defend someone they expected you to protect. This is where people often discover that your loyalty has limits. Someone may have assumed you would automatically defend a friend, relative, or person you care about simply because of your relationship with them. Then they accidentally overhear you refusing to excuse their behavior, and suddenly their idea of you changes. You weren't being disloyal, you were being honest. You understood that caring about someone doesn't mean pretending they're always right. Sometimes real loyalty means telling the truth when the truth is uncomfortable. It means refusing to turn someone's bad decision into someone else's fault just to protect their image. That can shock people because many relationships are built on silent agreements. Protect me, agree with me, and don't challenge me when I'm wrong. But you may have reached a point where you no longer confuse loyalty with blind support. The moment they hear you say, in your own words, that you don't agree with what happened, they may realize something important about your character. You aren't controlled by pressure to take sides. You can care about someone and still hold them accountable. And that makes your loyalty more valuable, not less. Because anyone can support a person when everything is easy. The real test is whether you can tell someone the truth when defending them would be easier. That accidental conversation may have revealed that your loyalty isn't cheap. It has principles. Number 6. They realized the person they were reporting you to was already on your side. The shock here comes from discovering that the story they were carefully carrying around wasn't landing the way they expected. They may have believed they were gaining influence by telling someone about you, shaping opinions, or presenting themselves as the reasonable person in the situation. Then they accidentally hear something that exposes a completely different reality. The person they were reporting you to had already noticed the inconsistencies. Maybe they had heard your side directly. Maybe they had watched enough of the situation to recognize that certain details didn't add up. Or maybe they simply understood that every story has two sides and refused to accept one person's version as absolute truth. Suddenly, the storyteller loses the advantage they thought they had. And the most uncomfortable part is realizing that you didn't need to campaign for yourself. You didn't have to chase people around explaining your character. You didn't have to turn every disagreement into a public defense. Your behavior had already spoken for itself. That can be a powerful lesson, because people sometimes mistake talking more for having more influence. But repeating a story doesn't automatically make it true. When they discover that the person they trusted with their version of events wasn't convinced, their entire strategy can unravel. They may finally understand that reputation isn't built by controlling every conversation. It's built by consistency. And when your actions consistently contradict the story being told about you, eventually the story starts collapsing under its own weight. Number 7. They heard you say something that exposed the real reason you walked away. People are remarkably good at creating explanations for someone else's departure, especially when the real reason makes them uncomfortable. They may have decided you left because you were proud, difficult, jealous, or simply tired of them. That explanation allowed them to avoid looking too closely at their own behavior. Then they accidentally hear the truth. Maybe you explained that you walked away because trust had been repeatedly broken. Maybe you mention a pattern you could no longer ignore. Maybe you revealed that staying was costing you your peace, your focus, or your ability to move forward. Suddenly, the story they created around your departure doesn't survive. And the most powerful part is that your reason may not be dramatic at all. Sometimes people expect a huge betrayal when the truth is much simpler. You got tired of accepting what you already knew wasn't healthy for you. That realization can hit hard because it removes the comfort of blaming your personality. If your decision came from repeated experiences rather than one emotional moment, then there is no easy accusation to hide behind. You didn't leave to make a statement. You left because something became clear. And once clarity arrives, continuing the same situation can feel dishonest to yourself. That overheard conversation may therefore reveal the truth they never wanted to consider. You didn't walk away because you stopped caring. You walked away because caring was no longer enough to make you stay. Number 8. They discovered you had been preparing for a future they thought would never happen. One of the biggest shocks people can experience is discovering that your quiet season was not a wasted season. They looked at what you had and assumed that was all you were capable of achieving. Because they couldn't see obvious progress, they concluded there was nothing happening. Then they overhear you talking about what you've been building. Suddenly the story changes. They discover that while they were judging your present circumstances, you were preparing for something they couldn't see yet. You were learning, improving your skills, saving what you could, planning carefully, studying your options, or simply becoming more disciplined. You didn't need everyone to know because you understood that unfinished plans don't require an audience. That's what makes the discovery so uncomfortable. They may have mistaken your lack of announcements for a lack of ambition, but preparation rarely looks impressive from the outside. There are seasons when progress is measured in small decisions nobody applauds. You become more careful with your time. You stop wasting energy on distractions. You learn from mistakes instead of repeating them. You build quietly while everyone else is busy discussing what you're not doing. Then one day, they hear enough to realize you've been moving with intention all along. The real lesson is brutal. People often judge your future using your present. But your present is not a permanent address. And when they finally discover you were preparing for a future they never expected, their biggest surprise may be realizing that you never needed their belief to begin building it. Number 9. They heard you take responsibility for something they expected you to blame on others. There is something deeply unexpected about hearing a person admit they were wrong without immediately searching for someone else to blame. If they had built a picture of you as someone who always defended yourself, made excuses, or refused to accept criticism, overhearing you take responsibility can completely disrupt that image. You might admit that you made a poor decision. You might acknowledge that you handled something badly or that you misunderstood a situation. And instead of turning the conversation into a courtroom, you simply own your part. That can be surprisingly powerful, because taking responsibility doesn't make you look weak. It shows that your ego isn't more important to you than the truth. The person listening may suddenly realize that you aren't afraid of being wrong. You're afraid of repeating the same mistake without learning from it. That's a completely different mindset. And here's the part they may not expect. When you can honestly admit where you went wrong, you also become much harder to manipulate with blame. You don't need to defend yourself against something you already understand and have accepted. You can say, "I was wrong there," without handing someone control over you. That kind of honesty can leave people with very little ammunition. They may have expected excuses. Instead, they heard accountability. And sometimes, the most unexpected revelation isn't discovering that someone is perfect. It's discovering that they are mature enough to admit they aren't, and disciplined enough to learn from it. Number 10. They realized the secret wasn't about them at all. This realization can sting more than criticism because it removes the importance they secretly gave themselves in your story. They may have overheard something you were planning, discussing, or working toward, and immediately assumed it was connected to them. Perhaps they thought your change was a reaction to something they did, or that your next move was designed to prove a point. Then they hear the truth. It had nothing to do with them. You weren't trying to compete with them. You weren't trying to make them jealous. You weren't building a new chapter just to make someone regret how they treated you. You were simply focused on your own direction. That can be surprisingly humbling. People sometimes assume they occupy far more space in someone else's mind than they actually do. When they discover that your decisions were motivated by your goals, values, or personal growth, they lose the satisfying explanation that everything revolves around them. And suddenly, your behavior makes more sense. You weren't avoiding them to punish them. You weren't improving yourself to impress them. You weren't moving forward to make them feel left behind. You were moving because your life was asking you to move. That accidental discovery can completely change the dynamic. They may realize that while they were studying your reactions, you were focused on your destination. And perhaps the most powerful part is this: you didn't have to defeat them to move forward. You simply stopped making them part of the equation. Number 11. They heard you describe them without knowing they were being discussed. There is a particular kind of shock that happens when someone hears themselves described accurately without having the chance to control the conversation. They may have believed you misunderstood them, overlooked their behavior, or simply didn't pay enough attention to notice what was happening. Then they hear you explain the pattern. Not with insults, not with exaggeration, just calmly describing what you have repeatedly observed. You mention how their behavior changes depending on who is around. You point out the promises that never seem to match the actions. You explain how certain conversations always follow the same pattern. Suddenly, details they thought were random begin looking connected, and that's what makes it uncomfortable. You weren't necessarily collecting evidence against them. You were simply paying attention. People often underestimate how much their repeated behavior reveals. One strange moment can be dismissed. Two can be coincidence. But when the same behavior keeps appearing, eventually it becomes a pattern, and patterns are difficult to explain away. The person overhearing you may also realize something else. You weren't trying to destroy their reputation. You were making sense of your own experience. That difference matters. You weren't saying, "Everyone needs to know who they are." You were saying, in your own way, "This is what I've noticed, and this is why I respond differently now." That can be far more unsettling than an angry confrontation because there is no dramatic outburst to dismiss, just observation, just memory, and a description that sounds uncomfortably close to the truth. Number 12. They discovered you had already accepted an outcome. They were still trying to control. Some people don't realize how much power they have lost until they discover that you have already made peace with the outcome they are still trying to influence. They may have assumed you were waiting for their apology, approval, explanation, decision, or permission before you could move forward. Then they overhear you speaking about it as something you've already accepted. That changes everything. You are no longer waiting for the perfect conversation. You are no longer depending on them to behave differently before you can be okay. You have simply accepted what happened and decided what you will do next. This can be difficult for someone who was comfortable believing they still had emotional control over the situation. They may have expected you to remain available, uncertain, or hopeful that things would return to the way they were. Instead, they discover that your mind has already moved forward. And acceptance doesn't mean you approved of what happened. It means you stopped allowing something outside your control to dictate your next step. That's a major difference. You can acknowledge disappointment without living inside it. You can recognize that something ended without spending every day trying to reopen it. You can care about what happened while still choosing a different direction. The accidental conversation reveals something powerful. They were still negotiating an ending that you had already accepted. And once someone realizes they no longer control the outcome, they may finally understand that your next chapter doesn't require their cooperation. Number 13. They heard the one sentence that revealed your entire strategy. Sometimes a single sentence can explain months or even years of behavior without you realizing anyone is listening. You may casually say something about what you learned, what you refuse to repeat, or what you're doing differently now. To you, it may sound ordinary. To the person overhearing it, it can sound like the missing piece of a much bigger puzzle. Suddenly, your previous decisions start making sense. They understand why you stopped accepting certain situations. They understand why you became more selective with your time. They understand why particular opportunities no longer impress you, or why certain people no longer have the same access to you. The sentence wasn't necessarily a detailed plan. It was a principle. And principles can explain more than plans because they reveal how someone thinks. Maybe you said you no longer make important decisions just to please people. Maybe you mentioned that you learned to judge consistency rather than promises. Maybe you simply explained that you would rather lose an opportunity than compromise something important to you. That one statement can expose the thinking behind dozens of choices, and suddenly someone realizes your actions weren't random. There was a reason, there was a pattern, there was a strategy. The irony is that you may not have intended to reveal anything at all. You weren't making an announcement, you weren't trying to impress anyone. You were simply speaking honestly. But that one sentence gave someone enough information to finally understand the logic behind your transformation. And once they understand the principle driving you, they may realize they've been interpreting your behavior completely wrong. Number 14. They realized they had been studying the wrong person. The biggest shock may not be what they overheard. It may be what that information forced them to admit about everything they believed about you. They had been studying your reactions, analyzing your choices, watching who you talked to, and trying to figure out what made you tick. They thought understanding your behavior meant understanding you. Then one accidental conversation exposed how incomplete their picture really was. They suddenly realized that the person they had been analyzing was only the version of you they had access to. They didn't know your private reasoning. They didn't know what you had learned. They didn't know which experiences had changed your priorities or which lessons had completely altered the way you made decisions. And that's where the real surprise begins. They may replay old moments and notice details they previously dismissed. Your decisions start looking less random. Your boundaries make more sense. Your changes no longer seem mysterious. Even your refusal to participate in certain situations begins to look deliberate. The truth is, people can study your behavior for years and still misunderstand your motives. Knowing what someone does isn't the same as knowing why they do it. That accidental discovery may therefore expose the biggest mistake they made. They were trying to decode you from the outside while ignoring the deeper reasons behind your choices. They thought they had figured you out. Then they heard one honest piece of your story and realized they had been analyzing the wrong person, or, more accurately, a version of you that never existed in the first place. Conclusion. Sometimes the biggest revelation isn't that someone discovered your secret. It's that they discovered how badly they had misunderstood you. They thought your quietness meant confusion. They mistook your distance for emotion. They assumed you didn't know the truth because you never confronted them with it. They judged your present without knowing what you were preparing for. They expected you to defend people blindly, blame everyone else, or keep waiting for an outcome they believed they could control. Then, one accidental conversation changed the entire picture. They heard the reasoning behind your decisions. They discovered that you had noticed more than you revealed. They learned that some of your choices were based on patterns, not moods. They realized that your growth wasn't a performance for them, and that your future wasn't built to prove anybody wrong. And perhaps that's the deepest lesson of all. People can study your behavior, and still completely misunderstand your character. You don't owe everyone access to your thoughts. You don't have to explain every decision while you're making it. You don't have to announce every lesson you've learned or reveal every plan before it becomes reality. Sometimes, people only understand the depth of your transformation after they accidentally hear the truth behind it. So if something you've heard today feels strangely familiar, don't rush to expose yourself or prove anything to anyone. Let the truth remain the truth. Keep growing, keep learning, keep making decisions that align with the person you're becoming, because eventually people may discover that the version of you they thought they understood was never the whole story, and that realization can change everything. If this message spoke to you, subscribe to the channel and become part of this community. Don't forget to like this video, because it helps more people discover these conversations. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment telling us which point hit you the hardest. Your perspective